Hello, welcome to Newscentre. With me, Parikshit Luthra. Russia has mounted its offensive in Ukraine, launching a series of airstrikes across multiple cities, including the capital city of Kyiv. The strikes smashed civilian targets, killing at least 19 people and leaving over 100 injured. Air raid sirens are daunting over several regions in Ukraine, warning of the possibility of more Russian airstrikes. Russian President Putin called these strikes a response to Kyiv's terrorist action, including an attack on a bridge to the Russia-controlled Crimean Peninsula. These attacks come days after Ukraine claimed to have regained territories captured by Russian forces. Ukrainian President Zelensky, in his nightly address, said Ukraine is not intimidated by the Russian strikes and his forces would make the battlefield more painful. Meanwhile, India voted to reject Russia's demand to have a secret ballot in the UNGA on annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions. The government has also advised citizens to not travel to Ukraine amid the ongoing conflict. Let me go across to our guests this evening. We are joined by Tom Karako, Director of Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Also joining us is Bohdan Nahaylo, Chief Editor at the Kyiv Post. Thank you very much for joining us. Tom, let me begin by asking you, how would you differentiate the intensity of Russian action that we see over the last 24 to 48 hours to what has been happening since the start of the war in February?
Well, look, there's certainly been thousands of missile strikes by Russia in Ukraine over the past number of months. This certainly looked like a bit of a spasm, a kind of a missile temper tantrum in retaliation for the strike on the Crimean Bridge. But I also would say it's a sign of weakness. This was a very expensive strike. If you think about the cost of the reported cost of the missiles that were involved here, these were apparently some higher-end things. Kind of some debates about the effects. Perhaps other folks can speak to that in just a moment here in terms of the actual effect on the ground. But it was an expensive attack. It was a ruthless and indiscriminate attack. But you know, it really, I think, again, speaks to Russian relative weakness at this point.
All right, Bohdan, to get you in, as Tom was speaking about, that there is a debate about the actual damage caused by the recent missile strikes, 85 in number. What has been the damage on the ground? We are reading reports about power cuts across several cities because of the airstrikes.
Yes, you're quite right. They seem to be targeting this time infrastructure. We expected this in the first days of the war. They didn't go for the electricity providers, the internet centers and whatnot. But this is what they are apparently doing. I think this is partly logistical in the sense of trying to weaken Ukraine's war effort before the onset of the cold weather and energy shortages generally. And secondly, to try and demoralize the population. You said this was an offensive. It's not an offensive. This is a cowardly retaliation, as my predecessor has just said, to the strike on the Kerch Bridge linking Russia to Russian-occupied Crimea. The Russians are fighting a very cowardly war. They are losing on the battlefield. They are retreating in the south and in the north, in the Kharkiv region. And what's left for them is to hurl missiles from the Caspian Sea, airplanes there, or send kamikaze drones, Iranian drones from Belarus. So the damage in Kyiv, I'm based in Kyiv at the moment, look, it was horrific to see several rockets land in the center of Kyiv and to see the bodies and the smashed cars, right? But we've been used to that now. This particular phase of the intensified war has been continuing since February, but we've been at war with Russia effectively since 2014 when they seized Crimea and the Donbass. That war in the Donbass never stopped. So right now, the Ukrainians are making gain. Morale is high, and there is a sense of outrage, you know, throughout the country. Let me just, one last note. They are not just targeting Kyiv and the east of Ukraine. They are hitting areas in the west of Ukraine, Lviv, for example, the western city, in Transcarpathia, in the Odessa region. The attacks are spread throughout the country, and it's a large country.
Right. The attacks are spread across the country that you are seeing, Bohdan. But coming back to Tom, we're also getting reports, and we're reading how the British intelligence is saying that Russia is falling short of weapons. Their forces are exhausted. The fact that they are now fielding released prisoners shows how desperate they are. How seriously would you take this reportage and Russia's capacity to continue this war?
You know, I did see that report. I hope that's true. I'm a little bit cautious about being too premature in terms of the number of missiles that Russia has. They do have quite a few. Again, I think it's a sign of weakness that they're expending them at the rate that they are, at the costs that they are. Yes, they've been hitting infrastructure, but these are really expensive long-range missiles to be doing that. So we'll see how many more they have. The question is kind of what do we do in reaction to that, I think. And I think the provision of increased fires of missiles of offensive forces on the part of the United States and the part of others, I think is a very good way to get after that, to continue to hold at risk, whether it be their air bases or what have you, into Russia, to give them back a little bit of the taste of their own medicine here. And so I think you're going to continue to see that. You're also seeing quite a bit of attention, and President Zelensky is talking about this himself, quite a bit of attention to the question of air defense and active air defense. In the past 10 years or so, we've really taken air superiority for granted in the West. That is something we can't do anymore. And just look at the extraordinary demand signal for any kind of air defense, be it old S-300s, be it NASAMS and these kind of things that are apparently en route to Ukraine right now. The Ukrainians claim to have shot down a number of these cruise missiles over the past a couple days that they came in. Perhaps some of them failed. A number of them seem to have been taken out in one way or another. So I think you're going to continue to see increased demand for that. The other thing is, if the British report that you referenced is true, right, if they are running out, the question is what's going to happen to the Russian defense industry if they continue to remain under sanctions and aren't able to reproduce.
Right. Those are important questions there. Bohdan, coming to you, the Ukrainian president has once again opened dialogue with the G7. What does Ukraine need at this juncture? What are they asking for from the US, the UK, the European Union?
Well, he's not opened. He's continuing the dialogue. Obviously, the G7 are strongly behind, like the EU, the States, and the North Atlantic Alliance. All the democratic states are behind Ukraine. They're asking for sustained support, no fatigue, in no let-up in the support that's given, moral, financial, and with arms in particular. Look, we've got two other factors here that need to be taken into account. We have the General Assembly at this moment, yesterday and until tomorrow, discussing the annexation by Russia of 4 regions of Ukraine. We hope that India will also not be neutral and will condemn this action. It's important for Ukraine to have the support of countries like India, China, Brazil, for instance, those that, let's put it diplomatically, have sat on the fence up till now. It's very important to resist this temptation to fall into the blackmail from the Kremlin about nuclear war. What is left for Putin, who is in a very weakened position at home domestically, is waving his nuclear missiles. Remember, it's not just nuclear missiles. There are nuclear power stations, one of which, the largest in Europe, is in the hands of the Russians right now. The blackmail is very tough. The other thing I would say is that, you know, they threatened the world with starvation. They were saying, well, you know, unless Ukraine stops the war, although they were occupying the very important agricultural areas of Ukraine and blocking the ports, there will be famine. You know, everybody from India to Africa will suffer. It's very important not to fall into this kind of blackmail and to hold a united stance at a time when we have a guy in the Kremlin who is feared by his own people. Look, more Russians have left to avoid mobilization men than have actually been conscripted. That tells you something, you know.
Right. That's an important point, Bohdan, but let me now go back to Tom. Tom, how is the United States now going to step up support for Ukraine? And a connected question, to what extent can the United States get further involved in this conflict? They are not directly involved. They're supporting Ukraine with intelligence and weapons. But if this conflict escalates further, and there are strong signs that it may happen, to what extent can U.S. involvement increase?
Well, first of all, I just want to agree with what Bohdan said there about complimenting India and other folks for weighing in diplomatically. That's a very welcome sign. But I would say for the part of the United States, I would say that we're pretty deeply involved here in terms of the provision of arms, and I think that's, but also intelligence and perhaps assistance on the non-kinetic or cyber side of things. There's probably a lot of that going on that we don't see. So, frankly, I think there's a lot there. There are further steps that could be taken. For instance, the provision of longer range missiles to the Ukrainians. There's kind of a cessation of the Ukrainians' ask for the ATACMS, which is the longer range missile that goes into the HIMARS launcher. There are certainly those things. There is questions about the kind of where this goes in terms of the handing off of various munitions. But there are further steps that could be taken. I would also, again, agree with my colleague here, Bohdan, in terms of the fact that this is these nuclear threats and these threats of escalation. I mean, come on, they've already escalated at this point, trying to go after Ukraine existentially. That is pretty escalatory so far. But those nuclear threats, that is a sign of weakness, and so I think we just have to wear them down slowly, gradually, without giving them further excuses, but slowly, quietly. And lethally wear them down.
Right. Bohdan, when we speak about Belarus President Lukashenko has deployed his own troops alongside the Russian troops along the Ukraine border, along some parts of it. What could be the possible impact and dangers of this now?
Well, Belarus is obviously a captive nation, and it's under a cruel dictator who imposed himself, having cheated in the elections. The population is not supporting him, and it's not supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So he has a tough uphill battle because he's resisted so far from doing what the Russians want, falling squarely behind the Russians, and he's tried to say that Belarus is not really involved. Yesterday, he obviously was pushed by Putin into agreeing to the establishment of a regional force. Euphemistically, what does that mean? We know from even the Belarusian side, the official Belarusian side, that the Ukrainians are well prepared on their side of the border. They've blown up bridges. They are waiting for the Belarusians to come, if they come. And they won't be Belarusians, they'll be Russians, essentially. Now, I think that the main tactic here is to deter Ukrainians, or rather to distract Ukraine and to take away forces that by defending Kyiv that would normally be utilized in the south and in the ongoing offensive in the northeast. So I think it's more of a distraction and not really something we can expect. On the other hand, it is quite clear that the Russians are using Belarus as a staging area for air attacks, and increasingly they're using Iranian drones, not just missiles, kamikaze drones, as we call them, to attack targets in Ukraine. What will happen? I don't know, but I would guess that within Belarus itself there will be a resistance movement, and there will be continuing sabotage of railway lines, attacks on supply depots and whatnot, because the Belarusians also want to be part of Europe. They don't want to be part of a dictatorial Eurasia imposed by Russia.
All right, we've run out of time, but very quickly, Tom, in just about 10, 15 seconds, do you feel that US, as this war now takes a new turn, will US now put more pressure on countries like India to come out, take a stand, and try and push Russia to come to the negotiating table in a sincere manner?
Well, we'll see whether Russia's willing to do that. But I think that our friends in India, I think we're coming to recognize really the Russians for their true colors. And I think this is an opportunity to recognize that we have threats in common. We have China as a geopolitical rival to us both. And I think we should use this as an opportunity to recognize and look forward to the future about that which we have in common and push back on the likes of Russia and China together.
Right. Tom Karako Bohdan Nahaylo, thank you so much for joining us here on Newscentre on the current developments in the Ukraine-Russia war. We're heading into a short break, but don't go anywhere. We've got an exclusive interview with Cisco's Dave West, who says 5G implementation is integral to its India plan and how a pan-India telecom license will help the company. Don't go anywhere. That interview is coming up. Welcome back. You're watching Newscentre. 5G implementation is integral to Cisco's plans in India. That's the word coming in from Dave West, president of the China, Japan and Greater Pacific region at Cisco. In a chat with CNBC-TV18's Ashmit Kumar, Dave West also elaborated on the company's plans for India going forward. Listen in.
The 5G implementations are just an extension of the work that we're doing in terms of helping India digitize, deliver services at speed and scale in the market, ensuring that we're making proper investments for helping and socially disadvantaged, connecting the unconnected. All of this is part of the 5G rollout in India. And when we look at sort of our work to date in India, 5G will play a massive role as we look forward.
Let me club this question of 5G with the issue of pandemic. What were your biggest lessons, your biggest takeaways in terms of traction that you managed to get over the pandemic, and then subsequently what that means for companies as they begin to get more familiar with hybrid forms of work style?
Well, the pandemic changed the world. Before the pandemic, we were talking digitization, and people thought of digitization as a buzzword. And through the pandemic, what we realized is digitization is fundamental to a business's success. If you can't see somebody face to face, you've got to be able to still do business with them, transact with them, collaborate with them. The world went hybrid. India went hybrid. In fact, what we saw was India was the fastest adopter in terms of consumption of our collaboration technology. Number 2 in the world for us. Number 1 for me in Asia overall. And so the world went hybrid. And in hybrid, everything changed. Our belief that people could work from home productively. The understanding that, that work wasn't something you had to go somewhere to do, that you could work from anywhere. And so hybrid has changed the landscape fundamentally, and we see that it's here to stay.
At a time when people are getting back to physical, where you see cars being parked in the parking lots of big companies, you see a lot of movement, people are getting back into their offices, a lot of companies insist that creative processes require the people to be under one roof. I'll ask for your take on that in just the next bit. But before we come to that, do you see this as perhaps a headwind? Do you see perhaps this impacting demand going forward, especially in a geography like like in India?
We don't see it impacting demand. In fact, we see it driving even more innovation. Because when people come back to the office, and not everyone will come back to the office, employees want choice. And they want choice to be able to work wherever they can. Because again, work is not where you go, it's what you do, and you can do it from anywhere.
As far as India is concerned, you mentioned it's one of the high-performing markets for you, fastest in Asia, second fastest overall. When you saw this level of adoption here in a market where originally there was not as big of a footprint, what does that mean in terms of Cisco deploying resources, investing here, looking for people here, having more manpower here? What did that translate into, this increased footprint here in the Indian market?
Well, you know, first of all, we stepped back and we saw how massive the India market is. When you think about the India market, you've got to be able to satisfy at scale for the India market. It's not ones or twos, it's millions that you have to be able to satisfy for. And so the first thing was that we have to make sure that we can satisfy the requirements for the India market. The second thing is that this market is digitizing fast. And it's a very innovative market. And so how workers used our technology, how they used it to collaborate, how they used it to share information, we learned a lot from that. And as a result of all of this, we've been building our infrastructure, our innovation locally in India. In fact, through the process, we launched 2 security clouds to start off. Our Duo Cloud, which helps us around zero trust and access control. Our Umbrella Cloud, which helps us around secure internet gateways or DNS security. And now we're announcing this week, after this interview, our WebEx Cloud. So the collaboration tools we've talked about, we're now bringing them to India and making them available in the India market. So not only did we learn, not only did we see India digitize and advance very fast, but we're also investing and innovating at the same time.
Let me also just get the same question from a slightly different perspective in terms of you've given us an idea of how the customer base here is not in the dozens or the hundreds, we're talking about millions. You also mentioned that a number of technologies being deployed. Let me ask you, from a Cisco perspective, the Indian market in terms of deployment of resources. Can you share a few numbers in terms of what your outlook is going forward in terms of what the investment could be, what the number of people here that you have working for you, what does that number look like? Some guidance.
Well, we're just watching the market, and as demand surges in the market, we'll surge resourcing in the market to help support the demand. And so I think every time we launch a new cloud service, every time we launch a new innovation agenda, we're also meeting that with resources to make sure. We have an incredibly big development center here in India. It's the 2nd largest in the world. 12,500 employees sit in India. And so most of those employees do a lot of our software development. A lot of our innovation comes from the work that's happening there. And as we launch more services, more software services, and new clouds, you'll see us meet that with resourcing to make sure that we can support the India market.
Cisco applied for a pan-India license. They managed to secure that. A lot of questions were asked. What's in the works? What is Cisco planning? So just for clarity, what does that mean for you, having this pan-India license, in terms of deploying it here in the country?
It means we have a local cloud to provide messaging and meeting services across the India market. And so you're thinking, well, what does that mean? Cloud can be deployed anywhere. It means that we have much more resilient capabilities locally in the market. It'll help us with delivering at greater speed, ensuring that the quality of experience, and it's all about user experience, is at its best.
One final question, and this is about the regulatory framework that we have here. India is contemplating a new regime. They've come out with a new draft telecom bill. In that bill, they've included a whole host of services as telecom services. They've clarified that for the benefit of the various stakeholders. The question I want to ask you is just your reflection of this draft regime. Of course, it's only on paper right now. It's not been put into exercise. Just your sense where the new regulatory regime that we have for telecom will also include a regime which includes OTT players, but importantly will also include you. So your quick take on that.
Well, I think everything that we're doing will support us no matter how the new regulatory framework comes out. And so depending on what's mandated and what the government wants to do based off of that regulatory framework, the new cloud services that we're delivering will give us a tremendous amount of flexibility in supporting those requirements. And so we're watching it very closely, and we think we're probably in a good position given the launching of both the security clouds and now the WebEx cloud. As the requirements come out and as the regulatory framework comes out, we'll be able to hopefully satisfy what the government wants.
All right, with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Newscentre. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.